I go by Simon, although I'm not too bothered about what people call me. My full name is Simon Cooper, and I've been married to Grace for 4 years now. We haven't had kids yet because we both enjoy our freedom a little too much. While that might change someday, it's not something we see happening until we're well into our 32nd. We both came from modest backgrounds, living just a few blocks apart, though we didn't meet until we were 18 at a college recruitment event. Grace thrived in college, eventually becoming an accountant. Meanwhile, I had a tough time with my studies and didn't even graduate, but I made up for it with a strong work ethic and a knack for business. By the time I was 15, I was working as a cleaner in local stores and offices. By 18, I was already managing a team of 30 employees and had secured contracts with several large companies in town. Grace was job hunting at the time, and I needed more staff. When she came to my table at the event, she handed me her resume and said, "I'm not looking for a clean. I got a job, but you might be interested in my number." I called her before she even reached the next table and asked her out to dinner the following night. Years later, we got married. It was a lucky break for Grace, because she also got a job in the purchasing department of a construction firm. She started at the bottom and worked her way up. After 8 years, she became head of both the purchasing and credit control departments. Thanks to our dual incomes and the fact we didn't have kids, we lived comfortably. Meanwhile, my business was doing well. I bought out 2 competitors and turned it into the largest office and store cleaning company in the city. It's not unusual for cleaners and security guards to notice anything unusual in offices. Their observations often spark conversations among the staff. 4 months ago, my secretary told me someone was waiting to see me in the reception area. She handed me a business card that read, "Kyle Foster, Private Investigator." I told her to send him in when Kyle walked in. I shook his hand and asked what brought him by. After exchanging pleasantries, he sat down and smiled. Before we got into it, could I grab a cup of coffee? I hadn't had any all day and I was craving one. I could relate to most business owners running on caffeine. My secretary quickly brought over 2 mugs from the coffee machine, complete with milk and sugar, but neither of us touched them. After a little more small talk, I steered the conversation toward the reason for being there. "Kyle, what can I do for you?" He grinned. "Please call me Kyle. As you can see from my card, I'm a private investigator. I'm currently working for a client who suspects his wife might be having an affair or is about to start one. The wife works as an accountant at Hancock Manufacturing, one of your city's bigger suppliers. Recently, the company hired a new salesman, Jared Nelson. Jared has a reputation for targeting married women. He's been sending flowers, texting late at night, and taking my client's wife out for lunch. Pretty typical. I've been following this for a while, but here's the thing. He's pushing for an overnight trip with her. I listened, mildly amused by the spy game, but then something clicked. I knew that company name. Grace's firm also sources materials from Hancock. This Jared Nelson sounded like someone I needed to keep away from Grace. I glanced back at Kyle, who was clearly waiting for my response. "Okay, I get it. How exactly can I help?" I asked, my smile widening. "Throws them away. Your cleaning staff could collect anything tied to him and pass it on to us. We'd run everything by our legal team first. There's no legal issue in gathering personal trash. Her employer has already given us the green light." He handed me a card with the CEO's number on it, saying I could call to confirm. I didn't need to save the CEO's number on my phone. I dialed, and he picked up immediately. He didn't waste any time. He said, "Simon, I understand Kyle Foster is with you. You're authorized to share any They also gave us some company info. Our legal team will send you a formal letter shortly. If you need anything else, just give me a call." I hung up, feeling pretty impressed with how quickly they wanted to get this sorted. Kyle grinned, and I could tell he was just as pleased as I was. "So are we on the same page?" "Yeah, it's all set. 000A. "Morning," Kyle said that should work perfectly. I spoke to my team, and Kyle told us to keep an eye out for early lunches, late lunches, flowers, and notes for about 6 weeks. At the end of the investigation, one of my staff said that the woman hadn't returned after lunch. We traced them to a motel, and shortly after that, the marriage ended in divorce. Everything was back to normal for us, until one day Grace seemed a bit off. I tried to get her to open up, but she didn't want to talk about it. About a week later, Zoe, who's been with us for a long time, an employee and someone I considered a close friend, came into my office. She'd been with me almost from the start and was 25 years my senior. She treated me like a son. As she sat down, I sensed something was wrong. "You remember that surveillance job a few months back?" she asked. Her voice was cautious. Of course, it was quite an experience, I replied, raising an eyebrow in curiosity. Well, she hesitated. I work in the same office as your wife now, and I've noticed something. The man we were keeping an eye on has been stopping by her office. I saw a big bouquet of flowers on her desk. She took them with her to lunch. Here's the seed that came with them. She handed me the card. As I read it, my heart sank. Dear Grace, thank you for helping me renew my contract with your company. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I hope you'll join me for lunch soon. With love, Jared rings Simon. How can I help? I quickly filled him in on the latest. Zoe, one of my staffers who worked on the previous investigation, now works in Grace's office. She just told me that Jared Nelson has started paying her visits, taking her out to lunch and sending flowers. I've got a card from him right here. Kyle took a deep breath. You're not the only one dealing with Jared. You're actually the third husband involved. Would you be interested in joining forces with the others? Absolutely, I replied. What's the next step? Kyle suggested a meeting with the other husbands at 2 p.m. Suggested we meet at his office to get the paperwork sorted and exchange any relevant information. I agreed and arrived at his office at 1:55 p.m. Inside, I met Billy Morgan, Terry Smith, Kyle and his colleague Mark Perry, who was handling the data collection for the case. Kyle started the meeting. Gentlemen, we're all here because you share a common problem. Billy, Terry, meet Simon. He's interested in joining the investigation. If you're both agreeable, we'll officially bring him on board and begin sharing information. They nodded, and after a brief exchange, everyone agreed the paperwork took about 15 minutes. During this time, I used my personal credit card to cover the $5 fee. The $500 fee was to make sure Grace wouldn't see anything suspicious on our shared statements once everything was settled. Kyle spoke to us all. The issue is Jared Nelson. Simon, just in case you didn't know, Bill's wife works alongside Jared at Hancock Manufacturing. Terry's wife is employed by the city's school board, which sources supplies from the same company. Jared has a very well-practiced routine. He sends flowers, texts, and takes these women out to lunch, usually trying to escalate things by luring them to a motel. His pattern with married women is disturbing. He pressures those with children and takes advantage of those without. He offers them free passes from their husbands. Kyle took a sip of coffee, continuing. Jared has been responsible for at least 5 divorces in the area over the past year. His tactics aren't very sophisticated, but they're effective. He even got sued by a group of husbands in Dallas, where he used to work, after causing he's been responsible for a string of broken marriages, and the lawsuit resulted in his termination. He's up to the same tricks here now, so we're doing everything we can to put a stop to it. Simon, are you still assigned to the clean team at Hancock Manufacturing or the school board's offices? You might be able to gather valuable evidence from there. Grace's office space if your team handles that area. I shook my head no. Unfortunately, we don't cover those locations. That's too bad, Kyle remarked. But keep collecting anything from Grace's trash that looks personal. We need every piece of information we can get. He then asked, who pays for your wife's phone bill? My company, I responded, and Kyle grinned. Here's what we'll do. We'll need to access her phone records to see who she's been texting and calling. Just fill out this authorization form, and it will grant us permission to monitor her phone. You'll also need to scan this QR code on her phone. Once you do, a program will install itself. We'll start transmitting all our calls, messages, emails, and WhatsApp chats to our server. Jared avoids using landlines because it's too easy for spouses to answer accidentally, so most of his contact with these women happens on their cell phones. We finished the meeting by exchanging phone numbers and we set up a WhatsApp group to make it easier to communicate. It included me, Billy, Terry, Kyle, and Mark. The idea was to keep everyone informed and up to date in real time when I got home later that evening. Grace was already there, but she seemed a little preoccupied. She kept her phone close, which wasn't like her. During our conversation, she seemed distant when I asked about her day. She brushed me off, saying it was a long one, and that she felt tired. Then at 9:30 p.m., much earlier than usual, she went to bed. I stayed up a bit longer, trying to shake the uneasiness that had settled in once I knew she was asleep. I went to search for her phone, but it wasn't in its usual spot. I made my way to the bedroom and noticed a phone charger near the bed. When I took a closer look, I found it tucked beneath Grace's pillow. There was no way I could retrieve it without waking her. I went to bed, my mind still swirling with unease. Luckily, she got up in the middle of the night, giving me the perfect chance to scan the QR code, input the details, and return her phone without her noticing. The next morning, She wandered around the house aimlessly before heading to work, barely saying a word to me. If I hadn't spoken to her first, I doubt she would have said anything at all. It was around 11:30 a.m. Morning. Mark called from Kyle's office. They'd finished analyzing the initial data dump, and he started to explain what they found. Grace had set up a new email account, which was apparently just for Jared. "This gives us an advantage," Mark said. "At first, we weren't sure how they were communicating, but now we know. We're trying to get access to his emails as well. Jared's messages are relentless. He's been pushing Grace to spice up her life, suggesting she needed new experiences to reinvigorate your marriage. He even pressured her into sharing details of your love life, which he's now using against you." I felt a knot in my stomach. I had a bad feeling in my stomach as Mark continued. He hinted at a weekend getaway during their recent lunch and is trying to convince her it's just a physical thing. He's arguing that if she really loves you, it won't be considered cheating. It seems like he's using guilt to manipulate her. I told Mark about Grace's strange behavior the night before and asked if she and Jared were still in contact or planning another meeting. Mark checked the messages she just responded to him a few minutes ago. He invited her to lunch at the beach club tomorrow, suggesting they strategize about how to convince you. His exact words were, "Simon, he loves you, and if you tell him it won't be cheating, he can't deny you a free pass." She replied with a simple, "Okay." After the call, I sat back in my chair, trying to figure out my next move. Talking to her directly wouldn't work. Jared was pushing too hard. If I confronted her, I thought about how I could get her to come to me. Maybe I could even arrange a hotel meeting. I realized that I had to decide whether to end this or end my marriage. I called Kyle and told him what was going on. Jared is making a direct move on Great, and even if I step in now, he'll likely push for a hotel visit. I need to come up with a solid plan. Otherwise, I'm thinking of getting a divorce. I feel like I need a backup plan. What do you think? Kyle paused briefly. Having a backup plan is smart, but if it fails, Jared won't give up easily. His ego won't let him back down. If forgiveness isn't an option for you, divorce might be inevitable. I can put together a packet of documents for your attorney, or I can recommend one. I've got my own lawyer. Thanks, I replied. Hune's already drafted a business agreement protected by a trust in case this goes south. I called my lawyer and set up a meeting for the following morning. I arrived at his office at 9:30. He gave me a knowing look. "What changed?" he asked, smiling. He knew me too well. I laughed and took a cup of coffee as the secretary offered. "Grace is on the verge of betrayal." I explained that a salesman at her job has targeted her and she's fallen for it. "I'm thinking of pulling the plug on the marriage, but I'm working on a backup plan. If she goes through with it, though, there's no plan B." We spent the next hour looking at what might happen. I was leaning towards a straightforward divorce. Our business assets were already protected by the agreement, and since we didn't have kids, there wouldn't be any child support to worry about. We agreed to sell the house and split everything evenly. I wasn't interested in going after Jared or his employer legally. It would be expensive, with little chance of success. Once we'd settled the details and the fee, my lawyer told me everything would be finalized and stored for future reference just in case. Over the course of the week, Grace's demeanor fluctuated. One night she was affectionate, the next she barely seemed to notice I existed. Then on Friday afternoon, Zoe, one of my employees, called to tell me that Grace had received another bid bouquet of flowers along with "I saw a postcard," and it was the last straw. I was typing a message in the WhatsApp group when I saw a post from Kyle to Billy. Jared had invited Billy's wife to dinner at the hotel. We all knew Jared's intentions, but things were still up in the air. I urged Billy to join me, hoping he'd take care of things soon. I wanted my situation resolved just as badly, and I was so distracted that I kept dropping things. I told the group about the flowers and the card. Mark replied quickly and said he'd check her email. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. Mark said he'd opened the WhatsApp app and seen a document. It was a hotel reservation for a place called Lakeside, about 30 minutes outside the city. The booking was for Friday and Saturday nights, and both Grace's and Jared's names were listed. I told Mark what I'd found out. He sighed and confirmed, "Yeah, but it gets worse. The emails are even more incriminating. I'm sending you one now." When I opened my inbox, I found an email from Grace that outlined exactly what to say and do. It was essentially a cheat's guide. Jared had sent her the hotel link 2 weeks ago, and their email chain showed him encouraging her and telling her how much he wanted to spoil her. In the final message, he He confirmed the reservation and gave her a script to convince me everything would be fine according to his plan. She was supposed to cook me a nice dinner, act extra affectionate throughout the week, and assure me it was purely physical with him, meant only to enrich our relationship. He left the decision in her hands, but it was clear she was leaning towards going through with it. I needed time to think. That weekend we kept busy. I didn't let on that I knew, but Grace's behavior changed. She was unusually kind and we were intimate multiple times. On Friday night, Saturday morning, and again Saturday night on Sunday afternoon, she initiated another round. Then on Monday morning it was like she was trying to reassure herself or me. But by Monday afternoon I was done playing along. Kyle called me around 3. "I'll call you at 6 p.m. Morning. Grace had messaged Jared to say she was in for Thursday night, but only if he felt comfortable. Kyle told me Jared basically forgave her, which was easier than giving her permission. I thanked Kyle for the update and asked him to put together all the evidence I mentioned. There were likely photos, and Kyle confirmed they had one of Jared and Grace kissing, though it wasn't a full-length shot. During the makeout session, I asked him to put everything in a folder and send it to my lawyer. I then contacted my lawyer, letting him know to expect the folder. We agreed to go over it during a meeting on Saturday morning. There's nothing quite like a divorce petition to ruin breakfast. On Monday night, Grace tried to get close again, but I declined, saying I had work to finish. I stayed up late in my office and finally went to bed around 2. I finished up at 5:30 p.m. She was already asleep when I left for work the next morning. A courier delivered the full report. I opened it in my office and flipped through the evidence, emails, photos and notes that revealed just how far things had gone. It seemed like Jared had ruined at least 7 marriages in the past 18 months, and ours was next. Just as I finished reading, Lauren, my secretary, walked in. I shared the entire story with her. Her face softened with sympathy. For the first time, I saw her as more than just a colleague of mine was really attractive. She smiled knowingly and asked, "So what's your plan? If she goes through with it on Friday, I'll file for divorce on Saturday." Lauren grinned playfully. "Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, right?" She leaned closer and said, "Why not have your own weekend with someone you've been dreaming of?" I laughed and said, "Who might that be? Me, of course." She flashed a mischievous smile and said, "Strictly physical, nothing more. You need to think clearly, and I can help with that." The idea was simple but effective. Make Grace face the consequences of her betrayal that night. I was with Grace, but there was no emotion in it for me. It was tough to pull off by Wednesday morning. Neither of us was in the mood for our usual quick interaction before work. The tension was growing, and Thursday would be the breaking point. By Wednesday evening, the tension had eased just a little, but it was still there, simmering beneath. On Thursday morning, as I was getting ready to leave the house, Grace woke up and started complaining about dinner plans. I decided to ignore her. Around noon, Kyle called with another update. Grace had messaged Jared, boasting that she was preparing a special dinner for me and promised to fill him in on our conversation afterwards. I decided to get ahead of her. I headed to the grocery store and picked up everything I needed: chicken, potatoes, vegetables, and a bottle of her favorite white wine. I got everything by 2:30 p.m. I got home at 3 p.m. I got back home, and in just a couple of hours I'd prepped everything and put it in the oven. As I was sliding the tray of potatoes in, Grace came home with a few shopping bags. She looked puzzled and clearly not expecting to see dinner already underway. "What are you up to, Grace?" she asked, eyeing the dinner preparations with clear confusion as she set her shopping bags down. I grinned, trying to keep the mood light. "I'm just making dinner for my lovely wife. I wanted to make it special before we sit down and have a chat." She looked even more puzzled, her brow furrowing. "I was planning on making dinner too, but after we eat, I have something important to discuss with you. It's going to be a long night." "Of course," I replied, turning away with a smile. I had already thrown a spanner in the works, and she didn't even know it yet. Dinner was tense. I kept the conversation flowing, deflecting any attempts to steer it toward anything personal. Grace tried to push the conversation in that direction a few times, but I urged her to enjoy the meal first. Once we were done, I decided it was time to take control of the situation. "Bring your wine to the kitchen and let's talk." In there, I suggested she look towards the kitchen table, where I'd discreetly placed a folder earlier. The letter, the evidence, everything she would need to see was tucked under a couple of magazines. She followed me, still clueless about what was coming. I removed the magazines, revealing the printed document. "Grace," I began, "you know I love you and I never want to hurt you." But we've been together for a long time and I've come to realize something. My lack of experience has been bothering me and it's become more apparent lately. Her eyes widened slightly and I could see her trying to. I've been processing this situation with my secretary, Lauren. She's been sharing a lot with me lately, and her stories are really interesting. I feel like I need to clear my head before we can fully commit to spending our lives together, so I've booked a hotel for the weekend with her. It'll be a chance for me to blow off some steam and try out some new things I can bring back to our marriage. It doesn't change how I feel about you. I'm telling you beforehand so it won't be seen as cheating. Grace's face flushed bright red. Her expression teetered between rage and disbelief. Over my dead body, she practically shouted. I want this woman gone by Monday morning, or we're done. Her reaction was exactly what I expected, and I couldn't help but laugh. The look on her face was priceless as the realization dawned on her. She saw through the game I was playing. She'd planned to say every excuse she'd prepared. I'd anticipated it all. I closed the folder and handed it to her, revealing the photo on the cover. Her and Jared locked in a kiss, her face drained of color, her voice a whisper. You knew and you played me. Yes, I said calmly, my smile fading. I knew you'd react this way if the roles were reversed. Unlike you, I didn't book a hotel. And I didn't share lunches, kisses, or conversations about love with someone else. My story was fiction, but your story is very real. As I spoke, she flipped through the folder. The folder was in her hands, trembling. Everything was there. Dates, times, photos, emails, transcripts of calls. It was all laid out in black and white. You followed me. You violated my privacy. How could you? She demanded, her voice laced with fury. I stayed calm. That's the crux of it. Grace, you've crossed a line. So it's time for action. You've got yourself a boyfriend, had an emotional affair, and we're planning to take it physical. You've humiliated me and put our marriage on the line. Yet here you are, angry at me for catching you before it was too late. I thought we might be able to work through this. But maybe I was wrong. Her eyes filled with tears as she tried to defend herself. You humiliated me, jeopardized our marriage, Simon. It wasn't like that. It was separate from us. I repeated, incredulous, that it was straight out of the cheater's handbook. You told me earlier that if you're going to have an affair, it'll be over my dead body. So why is it okay for you but not for me? She opened her mouth to respond, but I raised my hand to stop her. Grace, there's no such thing as a free pass. If you go through with this, it's cheating. And telling me in advance doesn't change that. She turned and fled upstairs, taking the folder with her. I heard the bedroom door slam and the lock click into place. I cleaned up the kitchen, my mind already spinning with what to do. Next, Kyle had set me up with a tablet that allowed me to monitor all of Grace's phone activity, so I sat down and logged in. Sure enough, she was messaging Jared. I scrolled through their conversation. Grace's latest message was filled with doubt. She told Jared she was worried someone might be watching them, that someone had copies of their messages. She even mentioned how I had made dinner for her that night and how I seemed to know more than I was letting on. Jared's response was predictable. He told her not to worry and just go through with the weekend as planned. He told her it would be fine and that her feelings for him were real. He said they had to follow through with their plan. He seemed desperate. Grace was wavering. She told him I was acting strange and that I seemed to have figured everything out. She admitted she was having second thoughts. She said maybe this wasn't the right move. But Jared kept pushing. He told her it wouldn't be cheating if I knew about it. He said it would only make her happier. I shut the tablet and turned on the TV. My mind was elsewhere. I had already made up my mind to file, for I was torn between getting a divorce now or waiting until they'd actually gone through with it. Part of me wanted to make sure she fully understood the consequences of her actions before I made any final decisions. I called my lawyer and filled him in. I told her the news. She's planning to pack her bags and see how I react. I don't want to file for divorce until they've actually slept together, but I need her to know I'm serious. Is there any way we can push this? My lawyer is as sharp as ever and had a suggestion. We could serve her a letter at her office tomorrow. It's clear that you know about the affair, and that if she goes through with it, divorce proceedings will start the next morning. She'll get the message loud and clear. I thought it over and decided it was the perfect way to demonstrate just how serious I was. Later that night, I checked the tablet again and saw that there were no further messages between Grace and Jared. I decided to call it a night when I reached the bedroom. I half expected the door to still be locked, but it wasn't. I walked in to find Grace lying in bed, her packed bag sitting against the wall. Seeing that bag sent a wave of emotions crashing over me. I didn't say anything. I just turned around and left the room, heading straight for the guest bedroom. She called after me, pleading, but I ignored her. She was lying in bed, fully clothed. I couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. The bag, packed and ready for her to run off with Jared, was the final straw. Made me cry. I felt like I'd lost something important, and there was no going back. The next morning, I heard her moving around downstairs. I stayed in the guest room until I heard the front door close. When I finally went down to the kitchen, I saw the bag was gone. Grace had unpacked it and put everything away. She was standing by the counter, her face drawn and anxious. My initial reaction was to lash out, but I held back. I suppose this breakfast is your way of showing me what kind of wife you'll be if you sleep with another man. But it doesn't matter if you go through with it, we're done. She looked at me, her eyes pleading, but I didn't let her speak. I've already spoken with the lawyer, I continued, my voice firm. You'll be served with divorce papers tomorrow morning at the hotel. There's no turning back after that if you come. I'm going home tonight. We'll start counseling and try to rebuild, but if you leave with him, don't even consider coming back. Grace's face was crumpled, but she said nothing. I glanced at her bag by the door and assumed the bags were already in your car. She turned away, confirming my suspicion without saying another word. Grace picked up her things and quietly left the house. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty kitchen, leaving me standing alone in the silence. At least Grace finally understood the gravity of her actions. When I got to the office, Lauren took one look at me and said, "You look. It's terrible." I gave her a weak grin and said, "You look as stunning as ever." Before she could ask more questions, I added, "I have no idea how things will turn out." When I laid out my plan B, Grace flew into a rage. She said, "Only over my dead body." This morning, I packed my weekend bag. She's going to receive. I'll send her a letter and see if it makes a difference. Lauren made more coffee and handed me a cup. I hope she realizes what she's doing. Surely she can't think this behavior is okay for her but not for you. I offered her a sad smile and sat down at my desk. The day felt unproductive, and right after 11, my phone rang. It was Grace, and she was in tears. "Are you serious?" she sobbed. "Are you really going to divorce me?" It was clear she hadn't expected me to follow through. I didn't hesitate. "If you go through with it, it's a breach of our agreement. You divorce me if I cheat." Her voice was barely audible, but she whispered, "Yes. Will you come?" "I'll be home in 20 minutes, I said. I hung up when I got home. I made coffee and opened a window to air out the kitchen. 10 minutes later, Grace came through the door She was holding an envelope for my lawyer in one hand, and her weekend bag slung over her shoulder. She dropped the bag at the door, looking unsure whether to come to me or stay back. I poured the coffee and gestured for her to sit down. I asked her, watching her closely, whether she was still planning to go to the hotel. She was flushed. How could she ask that after sending this letter? Of course I wasn't going to the hotel. I told her I loved her and wanted to be with her. I could do everything she wanted, but did she want to fix our marriage, or would she still be served with divorce papers? I looked at her for a moment before speaking. "If you go to the hotel, you'll only get served. There'll be no hotel, no papers. But our marriage has been damaged. Grace, this is what's going to happen. First, you're going to call Jared in front of me. I want to hear you end it. Then you're going to delete the personal email account you made for him. After that, you'll let your boss know what happened, and make sure Jared's banned from your office. We'll start counseling to figure out why this happened and how we can rebuild our trust." Just as I finished, her phone rang. It was Jared. She put it on speaker and his frustrated voice came through. "Where are you, Grace?" "I'm waiting at reception and I can't wait any longer." Grace took a deep breath and said, "Jared, I'm home with Simon. He did something that made me realize what I was doing. If I go with you, it'll destroy my marriage. I'm sorry, but you're not worth it. I'm not coming." Jared was really angry. He said, "You're a fool. You know how much time, effort, and money I've spent on you. And now you're backing out because your husband threw a tantrum." "Screw you," he shouted before hanging up. Grace saw him for what he really was. It wasn't love or care. It was manipulation. She took a moment to gather her thoughts. She deleted the email account. It took longer than expected, but after an hour it was gone. Not long after, her boss and the HR manager, Marvin Woods, showed up at our door. They looked serious. "Grace, we're aware of what happened today. To say we're disappointed is an understatement, but we're here to give you a chance to keep your job. Please tell us what happened." Grace took a deep breath and dabbed her eyes with a tissue. "About 3 months ago, Jared Nelson took over the AM Metals account that I managed. He started with compliments about my clothes and hair, but then he got a bit too personal. He started sending me gifts and asking me out to dinner. I let it happen and started dressing a bit more provocatively to get his attention. Over time, he wore me down with his words, telling me that Simon didn't deserve me. Then he convinced me to agree to a weekend with him. Jared sent a letter from his lawyer, and that made me realize what was going on. I told him I wasn't going to do it. I've told HR everything and I'm ready to move forward." Wood spoke to Grace's boss and then thanked her for being honest. "Grace, you made a mistake, but you're lucky too. I'm sure you'll be pleased to have this chance to keep your job. We've had quality issues with AM Metals, and we're cutting ties with them. Jared Nelson will no longer be coming to this office. Let me be clear, if anything like this happens again, you'll be dismissed immediately." Grace nodded. "I understand." Once they left, Grace and I sat down. We decided to have lunch later and started looking for a marriage counselor. Luckily, we found one quickly and made an appointment for the next day. The counseling sessions went well for over 3 months. Grace realized how Jared had exploited her fear of our marriage becoming routine. She saw how easily he had manipulated her. As for me, I realized how much we had built together, and I grew to appreciate the strength of our relationship. Years later, we're still together, and Grace is expecting our first child. We've come a long way, and we're stronger now than ever. As for Jared, he didn't fare so well a few months ago. Jared had another run-in with the law a few months ago. He had a nasty fall at the local shopping mall, slipping down a flight of stairs in the car park. The police couldn't figure out exactly what happened, but I do know this. There were at least 5 husbands at the mall that day, all of us dressed in black jackets and baseball caps. They tried to separate us and ask questions, but no one gave anything away. We were all shuffling around so much that they couldn't tell who was sitting where, and none of us were talking. One thing's for sure, someone made sure Jared got what he deserved, but as for who, well, that's a secret. None of us are ever going to share,